not an exception. That's the rule. It's always expecting something to change, and it's adapting to that. So it's an eventually consistent system that allows it to constantly compare actual to desired state. And I'm going to skip through this slide because I am now counting up, so I can see that I'm now over. It's very nice. It's actually not flashing at me or anything like that. So I'll skip through this as well. Apologies for the liberal. This talks about how it does the health monitoring and the recovery. And then finally, I want to talk about the platform being its own product and self-healing. And what we're going to talk about here is we've talked about vulnerabilities and security quite a bit this morning and today as well. What happens when a CVE comes along? What we're allowing this to do is we're allowing the platform team to simply do that deployment of the new platform without affecting the application team. So that's one of those firefighting things that is a challenge to DevOps as well. So let me talk about one last thing, and then I will wrap it up. Very quickly on cloud-native application design, I'm going to come back to Amazon again. I said Amazon deploys code on average every second of every day. Well, they're not deploying all of Amazon.com every second of every day. They've got lots and lots of little applications that Amazon.com is composed of. And those things all have their own release cycles, and they're able to release those separately. So we've got lots of little applications here that you can see on the screen. So why? What is it that these different microservices enable? And really, here's the punchline, the main punchline on this section. It allows you to scale applications. It allows you to scale the search service separately from let's say, recommendation engine or the shopping cart service. It allows you to scale teams. So you don't have one big monolithic team. It allows you to scale teams and have lots and lots of little teams, 2 pizza teams. It allows those things to have independent development cycles. It allows you to do experimentation. So the recommendation engine can be experimented on a great deal while the shopping cart remains very stable. And it allows you to be resilient. If the recommendation engine is down, you can still complete your purchase. So those are all very key elements. Now, there are quite a number of, as soon as you move to a microservices-based approach, it's no free lunch. There's additional challenges that come in around what happens when I have now thousands of instances of an app and I need to configure them. How do I deal with that? How does one instance of a service find another service that it needs if, as I said, change is always happening? So all of those challenges require a new set of patterns. And again, that's where Cloud Foundry has those things built in. Cloud Foundry is built for cloud-native application architectures, and it provides those things as support, all in the open source code base. So Cloud Foundry then, just to sum it up, is the world's leading open source platform as a service. It's supported by lots and lots of organizations. Here are and I'm sorry, I went through that very quickly. I know you were taking some photos. I will be posting these slides to SlideShare, so you'll have them all available there. But the Cloud Foundry Foundation, as you saw Chip talking about this morning, is a very, very vibrant community. And just like everybody else has talked about today, I welcome you to join that community. There is a great deal of energy and enthusiasm, great problems to be solved. And I appreciate the opportunity. Apologies to everyone for going over 5 minutes. I guess that's standard for today. And thank you so much for the attention. I'm going to be here all week, so I look forward to chatting with many of you. Thank you so much. Thanks.
All right, so it's funny. Usually when I come out and talk at these kinds of events, they stick me in the morning before everybody's had coffee and sort of developers right out of bed, and that's never a good slot. But then at the end of the day, you know, it's been a long day, I'm sure, for many of you, full of interesting sessions, and we're sitting in front of cocktails and dinner, and so poor Sam and I are sort of your your last sessions of the day. So we'll try to, at least for my part, try to get through things as quickly as possible. Typically, I have 30 slides to get through in 20 minutes. Should be entertaining. So one of the things you may notice is that the talk title is different than you may have seen on the agenda leading up. The original purpose of the original title of the talk referred to open source and software as a service. That is a topic that I am very passionate about myself right now. It's something I talk about and write about a lot. If any of you have the interest in terms of talking about it with me later, I'll be at Sandy's Pub in about an hour and a half, whatever it is. So come find me. I'm happy to talk to you about that endlessly. But one of the things I wanted to talk about, really was building off of Jim's talk this morning, in terms of sort of what we see from open source, what's coming down the pike, and just as importantly, what are the kinds of things we need to do in terms of continuing to move that ball forward. So Jim mentioned, the new Kingmakers. This is something, if there's one audience in the world where I can present the slide and not have to explain it, I'm pretty sure it's this one. Everybody, I'm sure, knows where this comes from. Everybody, I'm sure, has read this 100 times. This is what we see. So for those of you who don't know what an analyst is and don't know what we do, basically I talk to developers, I talk to projects, I talk to foundations, I talk to companies. Every day, lots of them. And this is what we do sort of every day, all year. We go out and talk to the folks at conferences like this. So we see a lot of different things that are happening. Sort of a lot of different things that are going on. The way I explained it to an audience at FOSDEM, I think it was last year or 2 years ago, was basically if the folks at FOSDEM are out sort of fighting the individual battles on the ground, we're kind of the satellites that are orbiting the planet. So we miss some of the things that happen sort of day to day in the trenches, but we also see things that sort of happen all over the world, as it were. We see different patterns, we see different trends. And the thing that we always come back to is that things are changing. And things are changing, that's a sort of cliche in the technology industry today, but things are now changing fast, much faster than we've seen. So in other words, it's in the water, it's in the air, it's in the earth, etc. Things are so different than they used to be. And, the question that we always get is, how the hell did this happen? And the answer is very simple. As Jim said, I wrote this whole book on it. Anybody read it in the audience? Anybody read that book? All right, I got a couple hands. For the rest of you, I don't have time in 20 minutes to go through the whole explanation. There are a lot of different things that have changed. There are a lot of different things that empower developers. We could talk about things like education. Jim, for example, spoke this morning about 60,000 people signing up for classes. That's a lot different than it used to be. In other words, when I was a developer coming up, if I wanted to take a course in something, I had to go justify it to management, who had to shell out a couple $1,000, and I had to be out of work for a week. That's a tough sell. These days, with courses from Linux Foundation or Coursera or wherever, you have the opportunity to educate yourself. You can, collaborate more effectively today than you could 10 years ago. We have, sort of properties like GitHub, which are massive centers of gravity. We have more formal structures than Linux Foundation, Apache Software Foundation, Eclipse Foundation, and so on. So whatever your needs, whether it's a couple people building a project, a side project, all the way up to something that's going to be commercialized and sold to vendors, you have all these, sort of different tools. But the biggest single change, the biggest sort of single factor in terms of the rise of developers has been open source. I don't really think this is an arguable point. Because all of a sudden, for the first time, if I want to build anything, if I'm a developer, if I have an idea, I can just go do that. Right? I can find very high quality, freely available software that I don't have to talk to anybody. I don't need to go justify to my boss, hey, I need to buy a license for an operating system. Hey, I need to buy a license for a database, and so on. I can just go do it. Right? So this changes everything. This is a change that all of you have lived, all of you have helped fuel. So, the difficulty is that when we look at this, for the first time in history, developers don't need permission from, the people that they used to have to ask, for access to these technologies, and that's great. And, we get into a world where it looks a little different than the businesses realize. So we tell the story all the time. It's funny. You go out and talk to sort of IT decision makers, CIOs, and so on, and they come back and they say things like, yeah, we don't use those technologies because we haven't issued them. Well, that's not really how things work anymore. It doesn't matter if you issued it or not, the odds are pretty good that developers are using your stuff. So this Venn diagram is something that we get a lot of questions about. We see pop up in slides from time to time. This is the world that we see. This is the world that we see every day. When we go out and talk to developers, what gets used is ultimately mostly what developers want to use. And sort of that's a new world. That is part of this shift. But as Jim talked about this morning, there's a long way to go. Right? So a lot of people, will make the argument, I've made this, sort of in certain contexts myself, that open source is one. And in many respects it has. Most of the new development we see, going on, certainly from an infrastructure perspective of open source, there's any number of metrics that we can pick that speak to the fact that, essentially, this is, open source is the way the business is getting done. That being said, if you look around the landscape, the bulk of commercial sales, anyway, the overwhelming majority of them, are still closed source. We have one sort of very large entity in Red Hat, that has sort of made, essentially a large business, a $2 billion business, $2 billion revenue business at this point, on a pure play open source business. So there's a long way to go. So, to document this, and to describe some of the changes, I mentioned at the outset that things are changing and changing quickly. Well, what do I mean? Well, I was in front of all of you, or at least those of you here today who were also here for this event last year. I was here last year, and one of the things that we described, was these generations of attitudes towards software. All right, so the first generation is that software is essentially a means. And the example that we use for this typically is IBM. IBM founded in 1911. When their software business got going, early 50s, sort of pick a date, basically the software was just a means, right? It was not an end in and of itself. The end was the hardware. Anything that sweetened the pot, incented hardware sales, anything that got people to buy a physical good, awesome, here you go. So this led to, what was not certainly called at the time open source, but it led to proto-open source behaviors. In other words, you had users getting together with users and sharing customized versions of the operating system. It's very different, right? And people don't, people forget that this is where software came from. This is how things used to be. Now, the second generation came along and said, whoa, sort of, let's pump the brakes on that. There actually is money in this. And of course, the canonical example for this category is Microsoft, founded in 1975. So they got a deal in 80, 81 with IBM, ironically enough, that allowed them to sort of non-exclusively distribute software. So all of a sudden, Microsoft signs this deal, IBM goes out and pushes Microsoft software, sort of far and wide, but they don't have an exclusive. So Microsoft can turn around and sell this to anybody they want. And all of a sudden it turns out the software is this good, this tangible good that can be sold. And Microsoft rises to sort of unprecedented heights from a technology perspective, really from a share price perspective, peaks around the turn of the century. And this was essentially, this defined the software market for years. Now, in the late 90s, right before that peak that I just mentioned, we have a sort of a new model that emerges. It says, all right, I'm not going to try to out-Microsoft, but I'm going to use software, specifically open source software, to build some other kind of business. So, the canonical example in this category is Google, founded in 1998. So they look at this and say software is differentiating. So if Chris DeBona or any of the Google folks are in the room, I will note for the record that Google has actually donated tons and tons of open source software over its lifespan. But historically, its infrastructure, its core infrastructure software was highly protected. Now, they kind of had one foot in, one foot out, right? Everybody probably knows the story of Hadoop, where Google doesn't make its open source, or does not make open source its internal MapReduce implementation, but they published 2 papers that make it possible for folks outside the company, Doug Cutting and others, to go implement the MapReduce algorithm in the distributed file system that we sort of know as Hadoop. So it was not open source, because Google's behaviors at least suggested that they thought that this software was worth protecting. So you fast forward a couple years from there, and the example that we use in this category typically is Facebook. Could throw any number of different sort of web firms in this bucket. And historically, these companies behaved as if software was not differentiating at all, right? So yes, they had core pieces of software they protected, but by and large, things that they produced here, we're going to donate this as open source. So much so that the initial donations of this code, were kind of just chucked over the wall and forgotten about. Hey, here's Cassandra, here's this sort of hybrid columnar database, go for it. And obviously, the companies have evolved since. I don't know if James is in the audience. Chris Aniszczyk, I think, is around somewhere, working for Twitter. So the companies got more sophisticated in their approach. But essentially, out of all these categories, right, out of these, sort of software was just a means, software is the end, software is differentiating, so on. It's really the sort of last category, software is not differentiating, that we're focused on here. right? Because these are the folks that basically look at this and say, hey, this is a good model. You know, our model for developing software is collaborative. Our model for developing software is open. And, you know, these are smart people. They've sat down and looked at the numbers, looked at the business case, and said, yeah, this makes perfect sense. Let's do this. So, you know, the question that we get, you know, very, very frequently from, you know, developers, from commercial organizations, open source projects, venture firms, and so on is, what does OSS need to do to take the next step? And I cannot tell you how gratified I was to hear Jim talk about issues, you know, quote unquote soft issues, you know, and this is the sort of unfortunate thing. You hear these dismissed, you know, soft issues, you know, such as sort of mutual respect, humility, inclusiveness, diversity. You know, because the simple fact of the matter is that we've done a remarkable job getting to where we are today, you know, with, you know, throttling ourselves effectively. You know, by not embracing women, by not embracing people of color, other gender orientations, and so on. You know, that is a problem. That is a problem that needs to be solved. I am hopeful, you know, that, you know, we're making progress. You know, you see small signs of it here and there, but it cannot, I stress this, like, you know, it really cannot be emphasized enough. It was so good to hear that. Now, the interesting thing is that when you have this conversation, you know, sort of, you know, with, you know, people, let's say from the more business side, you know, sort of the Lord business side. I don't know if Mike's in the room. He was wondering how I was going to work the Lego movie in here. One of the things that we have, you know, conversations about in open source, and this goes back a long way, right? You have a lot of people from the business side coming back and saying, this is just a bunch of hippy-dippy below, like, what is this? You know, we're trying to run a business here, and you want to talk about things like openness and, you know, inclusion, respect and diversity, all these quote-unquote soft skills. You know, and here's the thing, is that I can tell you, and I can walk through the case for you as to why you know, this is important. I can build the case for you quantitatively. It's not a difficult case to build. You know, more business in this case is just flat wrong, period. And the more important thing from my perspective is that, you know, building on what Jim was talking about this morning, is it doesn't matter. In other words, you can basically set all of that aside. If you have somebody sort of within a company who's sort of irretrievably ignorant and just does not care about things like mutual respect, things like diversity and inclusiveness, you can build a case without any of that. Because when you sit down and look at the changes that we've seen in the market in just a year, it is remarkable. It is absolutely remarkable from what we've seen, because basically what we're talking about is the economic foundation for open source software is solid. And, you know, this is the real change agent. This is the real, essentially, factor that's going to actually change behaviors. So in other words, you know, we bring this up and people say, I don't understand this. And you say, okay, do millions, tens of millions of Americans potentially, you know, particularly in the United States, do tens of millions of people in this country believe in things like climate change, believe that we should reduce, you know, sort of our dependence on fossil fuels, et cetera? The answer is, yeah. In other words, you can look at survey after survey after survey, and they'll tell you the same thing. They'll tell you that people care, that people think this is a real issue, and, you know, that we should do something about it. Now, when it comes to their actual behavior, very little changes. You know, we've all seen the studies. You know, basically the mileage that a vehicle gets today is, in many cases, you know, sort of for the average vehicle, you know, a marginal improvement over where we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Why is that? It's not difficult to explain. When you look at the underlying economics, it turns out that if, you know, gas costs 50 cents or $1 or $1.50 or even $2 or $2.50, yeah, you care about electric vehicles, but, you know, your incentive isn't necessarily there. If gas goes to $4, $4.50, or if gas costs $8 or $10 like it does in some areas of Europe, all of a sudden things like mileage become very, very important. All of a sudden you care a lot more, because the economic, you know, sort of incentives, the economic change becomes, you know, hits you sort of where it hurts. And this is the case with open source. You know, I believe, and I can prove, you know, certainly on paper, that things like mutual respect are important. But I can tell you factually, and if you look at this company after company after company, the economics behind open source and the changes that it will that it will essentially impact on your business, the impact that it will have over time is enormous. So we begin to see this, sort of just over the last year. All right. So I mentioned earlier in this presentation the Hadoop example. So Google comes out and says, hey, we have this, here are these two papers, the MapReduce paper and the Google File System paper. And Doug Cutting and a bunch of other folks at Yahoo go off and they build Hadoop. Hadoop ends up in Cloudera, which Ping talked about a little bit in his presentation. This was, essentially a model that more or less worked. Matt Cutts, who's a Google employee, however, when TensorFlow was released, noted a sort of really pretty significant downside to this particular approach, which is if you don't release your implementation, right, if you basically, from Google's perspective, believe that, it's still somewhat differentiating and you need to protect it, you're not going to release that source, but you publish enough details that somebody else can publish it, they're going to run into a lot of the same issues you've already fixed. They're going to solve problems that you've already solved. They're going to be behind. They're going to implement some things differently. So you have this friction, this unnecessary friction. So TensorFlow is an indication that Google, outside of huge projects, again, that it's already contributed open source, things like Android and so on, is beginning to shift its core thinking. The core behaviors when it comes to how it treats infrastructure software. These assets that, again, it historically has protected and not released as open source software. It comes along. TensorFlow, for those of you who haven't seen it, essentially is a framework that contributes to essentially artificial intelligence-like applications. Artificial intelligence, as most of you probably know, is a very, very hot topic in the industry right now, being pressed into service from everything from curing cancer to how do I order food more efficiently through Slack. You basically have sort of any sort of topic, any subject, any purpose it can be bent to. That is essentially the focus of AI right now, and that's where TensorFlow sits. And this is something, again, that could be theoretically differentiating, but Google has sat down, been smart about this, been dispassionate about this, run the numbers, and come to the conclusion that, the decision here is actually pretty simple. We're going to open source it. Same with Swift and Apple. Any of you follow our programming language rankings? We do them twice a year. Swift has grown faster than any other language we have ever seen. We started doing this, I think, in 2010. That was the first time that John Miles White and Drew Conway did the analysis. We've been repeating it effectively since then. And the growth has been unprecedented. So the interesting thing is that Apple got Swift to this unprecedented growth. We'd never seen anything like it. And, yet, it was 3 weeks before our last drop that they open sourced, the runtime. They made it available as, they made Swift available as open source so the developers could take it apart, improve it, change it, port it to different platforms, and so on. So this is, again, Apple, a company who is very, very sort of a wide consumer of open source software, not a huge publisher of open source software. They tend to, their business is obviously on hermetically sealed, very tightly controlled user interfaces and combinations of hardware and software, making the economic decision that, this is theoretically a differentiator for us. We came up with this, we built it ourselves, and we're going to release it as open source software. Why? Because the economics say that that's a smart thing to do. And this one, this just blows my mind. This tweet from this morning. This is, for many of you, it will depend on how long you've been in this industry, how many conversations you've had Microsoft over the years. Sam, I'm sure, is in here somewhere. He's up next. Talking to Sam Ramji when he was at Microsoft, talking to Jason Matusow, his predecessor in that role. Microsoft, you have pockets of people within Microsoft who understood, the advantages of open source, understood its applicability, were encouraging its usage within Microsoft. It was very, very difficult to get any headway. It was very, very difficult to have that conversation with the company. And now we see things like, hey, we love Linux. We're supporting it on our cloud platform. We're going to port our database to Linux. They take, very much like Google did with TensorFlow, they take, core assets like CNTK. They make those available as open source software. .NET is open source. So this is the company, again, going back to our generational diagram, that literally set us on the course of closed software. And they are increasingly and more frequently coming to the conclusion that the best economic decision for the company is to release things as open source. And I don't mean it in any binary sense. None of these companies are looking at this and saying all of our software has to be open source. But more often than not, when they look at it and they sit down and they run the numbers and they consider the pros and cons, the decision becomes obvious. And it's not just the folks shipping software. I don't know if any of the Capital One folks are in the room. This is a project you may have seen. It's essentially a DevOps dashboard. It's an open source product from an end user company. We've seen these sort of sporadically in the past. This is the same kind of understanding, the same kind of realization that previously, I've built these, for companies as a consultant, not these projects specifically, but, essentially proprietary projects that companies, enterprises would treat as their secret sauce and some special advantage they had over the market. Well, the fact is, in most cases, they weren't. In most cases, you're going to get more economic benefit out of releasing it as open source software. So basically, the net for me is that the thing that's going to take us forward, the thing that's going to continue to advantage the movement, is having the mutual respect, having the fundamental values, the moral values around inclusiveness and diversity, but really understanding that these all sit on a practical foundation, a bedrock foundation of, from an economic perspective, it's a good decision. This isn't something that's strictly a moral imperative. This is the right thing to do, both morally and in terms of running your business. And with that, I'm done. I think I'm only a minute and a half over. Minute over? Sure, dude.
Good afternoon. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jim. Thank you, Linux Foundation, for the event, as well as for inviting us to share a couple minutes together. I get the mid-afternoon lulls, right? It's just right before the coffee break, so I'm going to try to keep it dynamic, also try to keep it short. We're going to talk about the democratization of containerization, Docker's role in that, some of the thoughts we have after looking back over the last 3 years, and what that might mean for the coming 3, 6, 10 years of the dramatic shift that we're in the midst of. Someone called me sir in the lobby, so I almost pulled this slide as part of the self-intro, because I'm like, ooh, that hurt. But I did begin programming on a TRS-80 in the early 80s. We didn't have one at home, so true story, I took babysitting jobs at families that I knew had TRS-80s and brought my cassette tape so I could capture my programming skills. I bumbled into Sun Microsystems unexpectedly. We had a great time writing software that helped Sun's big graphics boxes spin these boys anti-aliasing in real time. Those of you who know early 90s hardware know that that was kind of cool. The universe, though, recognized that I should not be writing production code probably sooner than I realized it. And so I ended up in product management and operation roles in a series of companies over the last couple of decades, all generally speaking around the infrastructure layer, including right up until a little more than 2 years ago at Docker. And so Docker is 3 years old this month. And really, thank you to the community. Thank you to the Linux community. Thank you to a lot of friends and family in the room, IBM, Google, Red Hat, CoreOS, Intel. All of you have been Microsoft. I hope there's 450 partners, so I can't name you all. But it's been a remarkable journey. And I wish I could say we had a premeditated mindset 3 years ago when we released it, but I've seen the emails, I've seen the back and forth. We did not. But we've had a chance to kind of look back in the last 3 years and think about why, right? What kicked off this democratization of containerization? So I want to share some of those thoughts with you, what it might mean for the years to come. And I guess I'm not supposed to take Q&A, but please grab me afterwards. I'm happy to hear your feedback and iterate, rinse, and repeat. So this theme has come up a number of times today. Cornelia hit on it as well in different language, that software is eating the world. No surprise to folks here. I think what's surprising is that folks who are outside technology businesses are just getting surprised and disrupted on a moment's notice. And I mean, it's not like overnight, right? It's been going on for decades. Of course, Amazon, again referenced many times today, but go back to the 90s, Amazon showed how software could be used to give consumers unbelievable breadth and depth in choice, just starting with books, right? Very modest. Just start with books, but an experience that you could not get in any bookstore in the late 90s. Of course, subsequent to that, markets in travel, markets in real estate were disrupted with software. And for very, very clear to where we are today, but certainly not to me in the 80s on a TRS-80, was that media was susceptible to disruption by software as well. And your corner record store or your Blockbuster are now gone. Right? They're gone. Completely, media landscapes completely reshaped by software. And then more recent times, I mean, you stand back and think of bricks and mortar, right? So in the 90s, we thought bricks and mortar would be a long time coming before they hit any sort of disruption. But of course, wrong, right? Like Airbnb has come in and completely rethought the bricks and mortar hospitality business, and Uber and Lyft and others are completely rethinking cars. Right? And so the point of this, of course, is that there's no industry that's safe outside of tech, right? John Deere, tractors, agriculture, we got drones flying around to do shipping. And so software is eating the world, and what that leads to, of course, is big concern on the part of those industries that aren't tech industries. We're all in the tech industry, but if they're not in a tech industry, if you're in a bricks and mortar industry, if you're in a retail industry, you have got to be concerned about how software is going to disrupt your business, or how you can take advantage of software and its innovative capabilities to deliver new products, deliver customer sat, compete with competitors. And so, and the surveys, I just threw up one. I mean, the surveys from Gartner, Forrester, up the wazoo can attest to this, that they are thinking really eagerly about how they can use software to not end up like the last industry that got disrupted. And our industry has stepped up, right? We have gone out of our way to continue to innovate and provide easier to use interpreted languages. Open source, of course, has allowed accessibility to software up and down and sideways across the stack. We've evolved our own development processes in terms of how we iterate, how we ship, how we work with each other, and the collaboration technologies are far from the least important. I mean, arguably, right, the pull request will go down as the most innovative technology evolution in the 21st century, right? Just look at how it's disrupting how software is made in every industry. But of course, it doesn't stop when you commit the app, right, when you check the app in, and very quickly on the heels in the last decade, kind of the realization of you need to transcend the application pipeline beyond development, beyond QA, into staging, into operations, into ongoing maintenance. And again, Cornelia had some nice stats and language around this, that until the team works on a horizontal, right, across the different life cycle stages, you don't really see the full potential of applications. And a number of vendors, and I just listed 4 here, there's obviously hundreds in what's called the DevOps space, have tried to facilitate this speed across the application life cycle, across the pipeline, by maintaining persistent and consistent environments, whether it's dev, whether it's QA, whether it's cloud, whether it's on-premise. So into this whole conversation, right, this demand for application innovation, this demand on the part of executives, please don't let me be disrupted, into this splashes Docker 3 years ago. And again, I'd love to say it was all premeditated, but it wasn't. But we've been able to look back over the last 3 years and kind of reflect on why was Docker the flame that just kind of catalyzed this industry and caused it to take off to a new level of innovation and growth. So a couple principles of democratization. One is accessibility, or the fact that Docker made really hard but powerful technology accessible, right? So containers aren't new. Containers have been around for decades, right? chroot, arguably, depends on how you define containerization, but chroot back in '83, BSD Unix, right, was the first kind of demonstration of isolated processes. And then the BSD jails group, Sun Solaris Zones. More recently, Google and Red Hat have made wonderful contributions to Linux C groups and namespaces. So the notion of isolated processes and resource management, that's been around. So what did Docker do? Docker made it accessible. Up until March 2013, you had to be in the upper echelon of the Facebook systems engineering team, or a kernel engineer at Google, or half a dozen folks out there who knew how to take advantage of these primitives in the Linux kernel. And today, or 3 years ago, Docker run image command. Any developer can do this. Any sysadmin can do this, and they don't have to know about C groups. They don't have to know about namespaces. They don't have to know about kernel capabilities. The command line, if you've seen the Docker command line, the command line allows you to take advantage of those if you want to go all the way down. But you can get very powerful isolation, resource isolation, process isolation, and very powerful resource management without having to know anything about kernels. And that was powerful. That was powerful because all of a sudden you can have developers sitting side by side deploying containers side by side on the same host without running into each other, without over-consuming the resources on the host. And so that was really one very important element of the democratization of containerization. The second one was portability. And so in addition to an easy-to-use interface for getting the resource isolation benefits of cgroups and namespaces, Docker incorporated a union file system along with Git-like primitives to make any changes to that file system. And as a result, that image that is built inside a Docker container, its only dependency is a Linux kernel. And so it can go from a developer's laptop running Linux to a server